The purpose of this video is to provide a background on the United States Supreme Court, which is obviously the head of the judicial branch in the federal government in the United States. And the first step we need to really look at is who becomes a member of the Supreme Court. You know, this is the highest court in the land, whose decisions guide the rest of the nation, both the courts of the nation and the government of the nation and the leaders. So how do you become a member of the Supreme Court? Well, first of all, the candidate must be nominated by the President of the United States. But sometimes we hear, whenever a seat on the Supreme Court's open, that the President appoints somebody. But that implies that the President makes the final decision, chooses somebody, and then they are automatically on the Supreme Court. But that's really only half the equation. And that's why I like to make sure we use the term nominate, because at this point, Congress holds hearings. We call them confirmation hearings. And the Senate ultimately makes the decision, and they can either confirm or reject the nominee. And this does happen. Okay, it's not out of the question, and there's no rubber stamp here that somebody is automatically confirmed who has been nominated by the President. And just to kind of confirm that for you, we're going to take a look at the case of Robert Bork, who was nominated by President Reagan during the mid-1980s, just to show you how this can work.
Remember Robert Bork. He first came to fame in 1973 when he was the U.S. Solicitor General. Bork carried out President Nixon's so-called Saturday Night Massacre, firing the Watergate special prosecutor. Payback came when President Reagan nominated Bork to the Supreme Court. The democratically controlled Senate rejected the arch-conservative after one of the most contentious confirmation hearings ever. This is part of Senator Ted Kennedy's opening statement.
Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions.
Bork denied that, and while he didn't make the court, he did make the dictionary. Bork means to attack a nominee for political reasons. Robert Bork died today of heart disease. He was 85.
Now the question is, why do we make it so difficult for a person to become a member of the Supreme Court? And it's basically because once you were appointed to the Supreme Court, a justice has a lifetime term, which means that they cannot be removed based upon the whim of a politician or Congress in general. Basically, they have to commit a crime, accept bribes or something of that sort, in which they could be impeached, similar to a president. But other than that, they are on the court for life, and that could mean until retirement, or it could be until death, because we've had many Supreme Court justices who've served the rest of their entire lives. And so that's why we make it so difficult. So when we look at the current members of the Supreme Court, keeping in mind the idea of lifetime terms, Ronald Reagan, who served as president from 1981 through 1989, appointed 2 of the justices currently sitting on the Supreme Court. His successor, George Bush Sr., appointed 1 during his 4-year term. Bill Clinton appointed 2 during his 8 years in office, as did George Bush, and as has President Obama so far in his administration. And so you have these nominations made that need to be confirmed by the Senate. And once these people are confirmed, they're on for life. So you can see from looking at the makeup of the current court, with the justices being connected to the president who nominated them, there are 9 justices that sit on the court at any one time. And the reason for this is because all Supreme Court decisions are made by majority vote. So we need an odd number to make sure that we don't have a tie. You could have votes obviously then from anywhere from 9 to 0 down to 5 to 4. But these decisions are made in that manner. So if you can imagine the breakdown, it could look similar to this. where you have a 5-4 vote, 5 in the affirmative on an issue, 4 in the negative, and that's how the decision's made. Okay, but next let's take a look at why the Supreme Court hears a case, and we kind of look at it based on a few different situations. First of all, if two different United States Circuit Courts of Appeals reach different decisions on a similar issue. And you could see here, let's say the case is, was the search illegal? And the Ninth Circuit Court says yes, the search was illegal. And the 4th District Court says no, the search was not illegal. And so the Supreme Court wants to kind of break the tie and set a precedent that then will be followed by the rest of the nation, instead of having two opposing courts with differing opinions. Another situation could be if two different state Supreme Courts reach different decisions on a similar issue. And so, in this case, was there a violation of free speech? Well, a state Supreme Court in Florida says yes, there was a violation, and the state Supreme Court in Pennsylvania says no. So the U.S. Supreme Court decides the case so that everybody else in the country knows how to rule on any similar issue. And then finally, an important constitutional issue works its way through the appeals court systems. So maybe there's no disagreement, but a case on gun control makes its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they feel it's an important social issue that should have a conclusion so that everybody knows what page to be on. Okay, but regardless of why the Supreme Court hears the case, and keep this in mind that roughly 70 out of 7,000 cases brought annually to the U.S. Supreme Court actually are heard. So if a case is appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, there's about a 1% chance of it even being entertained by the court. But once that decision's made, it sets what's known as a precedent. A precedent is something that all lower courts and levels of government must follow that decision in similar situations, so that it's a system where we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. If we decide that one situation has an illegal search, okay, if this happens, the search is illegal, then we don't need another court to deal with it. We're saying that from now on, the police know that if they search in this manner, it's illegal. Okay, and when we talk about the U.S. Supreme Court, the question becomes, who has to follow this? What impact does a Supreme Court precedent have? Well, first of all, let's take a look at the federal level. So for the entire country, what it tells is that all the courts at the federal level, so that could be the U.S. District Courts, the U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeal, they have to follow the decision. It also means that Congress has to follow the decision. So they can't create a law that would go against it. It means that the president and the executive branch have to follow the decision. It means that any arms of the federal government, like the FBI, a law enforcement agency within the executive branch, they have to follow it. Okay, now, if we look at individual states, and we'll use Pennsylvania as an example. For Pennsylvania, what it means is that all the Pennsylvania courts, from the Court of Common Pleas to the Superior and Commonwealth Court of Appeals to the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, all have to follow the decision in any similar case. It means that the state legislature in Pennsylvania has to abide by that decision in any similar situation. So does the governor and the rest of the state executive branch. And any arm of the state government, such as the state police, have to follow any such precedent when it applies to them. It even goes down to the local level. If we look at the city of Greensburg, okay, the mayor, the city council, all have to follow the decision. The police and any arm of city or municipal government have to follow it. Schools have to follow the Supreme Court decisions. Okay, so, and other appeals courts do the same thing. Okay, except they only affect the people below them. So if the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court makes a decision, it has to be followed by everyone in Pennsylvania, whether it be the lower courts or the government or school or the police, whomever, they have to follow it. That doesn't mean other states have to, though what happens in our legal system is that if Ohio or West Virginia had a similar situation, their appeals courts could use the decision made by the Pennsylvania court as a guide, but they're under no obligation to actually follow it. And that's how the U.S. Supreme Court ends up hearing some cases, because one state finds on one side of an issue and another state finds on the opposite end. Now the question becomes, who can overrule a U.S. Supreme Court decision? Well, if you said Congress, you're wrong. Congress cannot overrule a U.S. Supreme Court decision. They have the Supreme Court. It's kind of a check on the power of Congress. If Congress passes a law that the Supreme Court rules as unconstitutional, the Congress cannot overturn it. Okay, they have the final say. Really, the Supreme Court acts as kind of a guardian over the Constitution. If you said the president, you'd be incorrect. The president cannot overrule a Supreme Court decision. So really, the one check that Congress has on members of the Supreme Court is that they get to confirm those members before they become a justice. The one check that the president has on the Supreme Court is that he gets to nominate a member to the Supreme Court. But after that, that's it. Okay? So really, the only people who can overrule a Supreme Court decision are the Supreme Court themselves. The Supreme Court can overturn their own decision, though it's not often these 9 people overruling themselves. What often happens is a current Supreme Court overturns a decision made by another separate court years before. A good example is the Plessy versus Ferguson case, in which a man who was 1/8 African American was refused service in the white dining car of a train. He was arrested because he refused to leave, and he challenged his conviction, claiming that separate facilities were unconstitutional. The court at the time disagreed and actually set up the standard that said separate but equal facilities are okay. And this decision, in fact, basically gave constitutional backing to all the Jim Crow and segregation laws passed in the South. And this lasted for decades, until finally Brown versus Board of Education, in which Linda Brown, a little African-American girl, sued for the right to attend an all-white school near her home rather than the all-black school that was miles away after a walk alongside railroad tracks. At this point, the court in 1954 reversed the decision of the Plessy Court and said that separate is inherently unequal, effectively overturning the previous decision from 1896 and rendering all Jim Crow laws unconstitutional. Now, that doesn't mean they were abolished immediately. People had to challenge those laws, but it was really the beginning of the end for segregation, and really a huge landmark for the civil rights movement. So when we look at the Supreme Court, just some basic facts to remember. First of all, the president nominates members of the Supreme Court, but they're not automatically seated on the court. Instead, they go through confirmation hearings and have to be confirmed by the Senate. Once the Senate confirms these people, they have a lifetime term. So unless they're impeached for some reason, they'll remain on the court until they either retire or die. Okay, the decisions they make set a precedent that has to be followed by everybody in the United States, whether it be the government itself or politicians or arms of the government. Everybody has to follow it within the United States. Cases that are actually heard by the Supreme Court include those that 2 state Supreme Courts disagree on an issue, or 2 U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeal disagree upon an issue, and so the Supreme Court decides to hear it. Or it could be just a constitutional issue, an important constitutional issue that makes its way through the courts. And then the only people that can overrule the Supreme Court are the Supreme Court themselves. And so that's kind of an overview of the Supreme Court. And over the next unit, in the Constitution unit, we'll take a look at several different Supreme Court decisions that impact us still today.